All right. So what we'd like to be able to do here, we have the basic logic of validating someone and actually navigating to the profile page if it's valid. But this information of who's who and their IDs and whatnot typically should live in a somewhere. So should it live here in the login page? Well, maybe not, right? Because the information that the knowledge that Alice has this email and this password and this username and this last name and whatnot, probably that information should live beyond this component, right? I'll probably need the same information about Alice later on in the profile page, probably, right? So I can render Alice full blown. I'll probably need the same information in the register page, right? So that if somebody tries to register with the same username, I would deny them, right? I won't let them. So the information about users in general is I'd like to be able to centralize all that information in one single place, right? Certainly, I don't want to have to repeat the same information across multiple components, right? So whenever you want to centralize any behavior that needs to be shared amongst multiple places, a good place to put it is where we call a service, right? A data service. Okay? So let's create a data service. Since this is fundamentally a different type of object, it's not for human consumptions, right? It's meant to have the role of the service, which means they're typically if it's a service, it'll be just one single instance of these things across the entire infrastructure. That probably will be injectable, so that I can use it anywhere by name. I can just like we had the router, right? This one instance that can be injected. I can ask for it so that I can use it anywhere I want. It'll probably provide an API that allows me to manipulate the data inside of the service, right? And maintain its data opaque and private so that it can't be accessed from outside. So since it's a completely different animal, we'll create it in a completely different directory called services, right? And presumably we're going to have several services, right? Typically one per domain object, or also one per relationship between domain objects. Okay, so let's create the user here, and we'll call here this user.service.client. Notice the naming convention, right? The naming convention is that has a part of the name is the taxonomy, right? Meaning either feature or object or what is the data type that we are manipulating, right? So this is a user service, so it's user, meaning we're going to be manipulating names and last names and passwords and usernames and whatnot, right? Service is the role of this file. Okay, there's some expectations of what we're going to put in here. It'll be a singleton. It'll provide some kind of API and provide some CRUD capabilities to manipulate the data type. And client, meaning this is meant to be executed on the client, right, on the browser, as opposed to next week we'll introduce something that looks exactly the same thing as a user service, but it'll be .server, right? That will merge these two components together that talk to one another, but that's for next week. Okay, so let's go here and let's create our class. So this is a class, and we'll call it user service. And notice that it's borrowing the name from the name of the file. And here this will be the sole repository of the data. And we had given you some data for users, yes? And ideally, it would be something like users, right? And it'll be equal to some array of data, yes? Okay. Now, what we gave you was raw data, okay? Objects, chunks of JSON objects, right? Ideally, this would instead be a little bit higher level, okay? And this would be an array of type user, right? There would be some class right, that models what a user is. Okay, so let's do that. Let's do that instead. I think that's a better approach. Okay. So let's model the user, and we're going to create again. We're going to create another class, but it's going to have a particular role. It's not going to be a service, right? So it's not going to provide any API. Instead, it's going to be used for modeling different pieces of data. So we're going to have here and create a user.model.client.ts. Again, the naming convention, right? The data type, what is it that we're going to be modeling? The role, it is a model. This is modeling on the client side because next week, 2 weeks from now, when we talk about databases, we're going to be modeling things on the database, right? So there will be a server version of this. There will be a schema version of this, right, on the server. Okay. Again, all these naming conventions will be dictated by your whatever team you end up working in industry, and you should stick to the naming convention of whatever your team decides, right? It helps to just look at a file and immediately position yourself. Where am I, right? You create your own mental model of how the application is structured, right? It makes it easy for somebody to start understanding that if I look at a file, where is it? The server, client, what is its role? All right, so class, user, and here we might have a username, which is a string, and we have maybe a password, a string. You have maybe a first name, string, string, last name, and so on. So everything would be here, plus perhaps even the ID that uniquely identifies this user. And we can have a constructor that allows us to build one of these, right? Perhaps we can pass in the ID, maybe the username, and the password. Let's keep it simple, just those three things, okay? And internally, we can copy each one of these into our local variables. All right, if you've done Java programming, you should feel right at home. Okay. All right, there they are. And notice that we're not using first name and last name, but you could have emails and addresses, and everything would be here, right? That you would be modeling. All right, and since we want to use this class from outside, we'd like to be able to import it. We can do export, right? So that it can be used from outside. All right, awesome. So now in the service, I can now go on and say, okay, well, I have a list of users. I can say users. This is an array of user. Okay, and for now, I'm going to say empty. Notice that it doesn't know where user is. It does find it. It says, do you want to import user model client? And you can say option return, and it imports it for you. There it is. So it imports it. Okay, there we go. So now we know it's user. And now we can create several instances of users. We can say new user, right? And this could be 1, 2, 3, and this is Alice, and the password QQ. And then we can create several instances of these. And so this would be Bob. And this is Charlie. And with different usernames. Okay? Everyone okay? All right. All right, so what do we want to do? Well, if we're logging in, we need to implement kind of like a finder, right, that can find users by their username and password, right? We can declare a finder methods here, find a user by credentials. So we can pass in username and password. And this will be a simple for loop that looks for this, right? So this could be maybe return users dot find user, and then this returns user dot username is equal to username, and user dot password password is equal to password. Okay. What is this? Users cannot find users. Oh, this users. This dot users. There we go. All right. Okay. So that is going to loop through the array, looking for the instance that matches username and password and returns that instance. Okay. So now that we have that, I like to be able to use these servers everywhere. Right? I like to be able to use it just like we did for login component and we did for the router. The router is a service, right? It's a singleton. Right? I would like to be able to do the same thing. I like to inject it in here so that I can use it anywhere. Not only in the login component, I like to use it in the register component. I like to use it in the profile component. Right? I like to be able to reuse this everywhere. So to do that, what we could do is load it. Load the service and declare it as a singleton. So this is the user service. No, it's not in there. Oh, okay. Wait a minute. Did I export it? I forget. User service. No, I didn't export it. Export. There we go. Oh, and I want to make this so that it's one instance and I can inject it into other components. So to do that, we can import injectable so that we can decorate our class as being injectable. Right? So that in the module I can then declare it as that can be injected everywhere else. So we can say import our user service. There it is. Before we weren't able to import it because I had not made it export, right? I didn't put the export keyword in front of it. And we're going to make it a provider. A provider means that it can be injected into anyone who declares it in the constructor. So this is user service. There it is. Now we can inject it into anyone we need. We can go into a login component and inject it here. We first have to load it so that it knows the data type. So it's user service. Okay, and we can inject it here. We can say private user service is of type user service. User service, comma, there we go. Okay, now we have it. Now that we have it, we can replace this code. Now we can replace this code. Instead of being just this one if statement, we can say, hey, user service, find me a user. Find me a user with these credentials. Right? We can say const user of type user is equal to this dot user service. This user service dot find me a user with these credentials of username and password. Find it for me. And we can ask, right, if there is a user, right, then we want to navigate. Right? If there is a user, then we want to navigate. Otherwise, we don't want to navigate. Okay? So let's see if we broke this. Save. So let's see. We go to login. Oh, now it's remembering this. Okay, so it's not logging in. Let's try with Alice and QQ. Okay, it found Alice and it navigates me to Alice. right? So all this, right, to have exactly where we started, right? But right, this will allow us to reuse that same service, right, elsewhere in the other components, right, in the login and the registration component, right, which will be a little slightly different, right? In the registration component, what we want to do is see if the username is already taken, right? If there is a user, we don't want to navigate, right? Whereas if there is a user, we want to add that user and then navigate, right? Make sense? Okay. But now that I'm in the profile page, I'd like to be able to display the information about that one user. But notice that regardless of how do I log in, if I log in as Bob, I still can log in. There's no distinguishing factor between logging in as one or another. Okay? Somehow we need to encode. In the URL or somewhere, we need to encode the fact that it was Alice who logged in and not Bob. Right? So to do that, we'd like to be able to encode here the ID of the person who logged in. Right? So we can treat them, individually as they should. Right? Well, let's do that next.